Hi, everyone. Welcome. I see everybody's coming in. My name is Wendy Nather. I'm a Senior Cybersecurity Fellow here at the Strauss Center, and I want to welcome you to today's event. And I want to introduce you all to our speaker today, Christina Morillo. And I didn't get that right. I'm sorry, Christina. I'm going to keep
You did.
trying.
Perfect.
It's
You did
it's the
perfect.
least I can do. Um, Now, as we come in, I just want to remind everybody that if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. You will not be able to post anything in chat, sorry, but we're just trying to get everybody to post in the Q&A. And we have a special incentive for you to post in the Q&A, which I'll come to in just a minute. As people come in, let me start by telling you a little bit more about Christina. Christina is an information security and cybersecurity and technology leader and author with an extensive background in enterprise security deployments and migrations to the cloud. In her current role at Trimark Security, she leads the Cloud Security Assessment Service for Microsoft Cloud Services, including Azure Active Directory and Microsoft 365. As a strategic thinker who thrives on solving complex problems, her experience has taken her to companies such as Microsoft, Morgan Stanley, and Fitch Ratings. She has also worked on partnerships with organizations such as IBM. In 2020, Christina signed on to work on an information security book with O'Reilly Media. This book, which is called 97 Things Every Information Security Professional Should Know, will be out this fall, and in fact, part of it's out right now. By demystifying security and technology, she hopes to make security accessible, approachable, and digestible with the overarching goal of keeping people and organizations safe and secure. And you can learn more about her and her work at www.cristinamorillo.com. And here is the special incentive. I'm putting the link to Christina's book in the chat if you would like to buy your own copy. However, for this session and this session only, the first 5 UT students who put real questions in the Q&A will be able to receive a free copy of her book. Now, if you are one of the first 5 to put in a real question, now, not a fake question like what, or is this going to be recorded, or can we get the slides? But no, a real question about cloud security. If you are one of the first 5 to put it in, the Strauss folks will take note of you and your contact information. They will reach out to you later, and you can choose either a Kindle version of the book, which is available now, or if you want a paperback, that's being released next week, and they will arrange for you to be able to stop by the office and pick up your paperback. Okay, so free books. Who does not like free books, especially about everything you should know about cybersecurity? So let me get started with Christina and ask her, as a professional, how did you get into cloud security, and what adjustments did you have to make in your approach to cybersecurity as a result? What did you learn about cloud?
Yeah. So the first thing I will say is that it's completely different than what we know about enterprise and being on premise, right? It's not, it's not the old days of like firewalls and routers and switches. That's not the focus. I got into cloud security because I began working at Microsoft. Prior to working at Microsoft, I was at Morgan Stanley as part of their enterprise information security team. And while they were, this was like the early days of cloud, it wasn't as popular, at least public cloud. They were migrating. I wasn't part of that project. And then when I got the role at Microsoft, that's when I was kind of exposed to, cloud microservices or just products, security capabilities, Azure Active Directory. And then that's when I started learning like the terminology. Pretty much by brute force. Like I had to in order to kind of keep up and understand what everyone was talking about. But thankfully, because of my enterprise experience, I was able to kind of not do one-to-one match, but understand, a little bit more about the differences, and why folks struggle with it. So kind of I learned by accident, I guess.
Well, you learn by learning, which is
Yeah.
how we end up doing a lot of this stuff here. Nothing is written down, but you kind of went from 0 to 60 going straight into Microsoft and learning about cloud.
Yeah.
How intense was that?
That was super intense. I mean, the good thing is that at Microsoft, we get like free credits to Azure. So we're able to like stand up an environment. We can download like configured VMs or configure our own VMs and connect it to the cloud. So kind of producing like or reproducing like a production environment and migrating over like our identities into the cloud. So there was a lot of hands-on, which I'm a hands-on and visual learner. I don't memorize, or I cannot memorize definitions or terminology or anything like that. Like I need to actually do it to learn it. So that was super, super important. And because, I sat in engineering, I got firsthand exposure to a lot of the products before our customers did. So I was able to kind of poke around, play around, configure, mess it up, break things in advance. But it was fierce. It was fierce. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll bet.
I'm still
So what
learning. Yeah.
so what are the some of the biggest assumptions about cybersecurity in the cloud that just aren't true or that are more complicated than you'd think?
Yeah. So, okay. The notion of like the cloud is just someone else's computer.
Hmm.
Yes, kind of, but you're still responsible for the data that exists on that person's or that entity's computer, right? So I think one of the assumptions is that, oh, it's just like enterprise, right? It's just like there's a one-to-one match. I mean, if I know enterprise security and I've been in IT for 25 years, I automatically know the cloud. No, not really. It's a little bit of a different ball game. Even if um, some of the terminology and some of like the infrastructure stuff is the same, it's just a different beast. So I think that's one misconception. The second one is that cloud is safer, right? Oh, if I'm in the cloud, if I have my stuff in the cloud, I can't get hacked, right? Because Microsoft, AWS and Google, they will protect everything. That's also not true, right? And then I think the third misconception is that, well, if I have my stuff in the cloud as a company, then it's the company's responsibility, the provider's responsibility. They're responsible for protecting everything, right? And that's not true, right? Because there's something called the shared responsibility model, which is different for each cloud provider, but it really outlines what they are responsible for as far as the infrastructure and what part you as the customer are responsible for. So I think that a lot of folks don't really do their due diligence and just think, oh yeah, we're just going to lift and shift and forget about it. And that's how we run into a lot of problems. And then I think the fourth one, just to add a bonus one, is that it's easy or it's easier. And that is not necessarily true, right? There's still there are a lot of knobs and switches that you need to know how to configure, and that you need to know that exist in order to stay safe, right? Your stuff is pretty much out in the open, so to speak. It's not behind a firewall anymore. So you need to do a little bit more work to protect it or to protect access to it. Yeah.
Mm, yeah, all of that. I was just talking with somebody at a really large bank the other day, and he was discussing how like you, he was mentioning that people who have been in IT for a really long time, 25, 30 years or more, are not necessarily ready to, you know, make the same cybersecurity decisions for cloud, that they're not really cloud literate. I would say that, for people in networking, for people who are focused on operating systems, anybody who, run databases, it's all different enough in the cloud that no matter, even if you're not part of the cloud team when you are rolling something out, you have to make sure that those other people are trained in the cloud so that they don't make mistakes that are going to come back and bite them later. Is that something that you've experienced?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think right now there's a really huge disconnect with folks that have the kind of hands-on experience, like cloud experience. So there's always there are a lot more MSPs and CSPs, obviously, because there are more people that there are more folks that or companies that are migrating to the cloud than employees or like professionals that can help support. So that's critical. What I do know is that folks who do have 20, 25 years experience are 100% able to learn all of this stuff, right? And I think that, I'm including myself here. I think we come with that knowledge and like the prior experience and knowledge that it's easier, I think, for us to capture, right? As opposed to, I mean, it depends how flexible you are and how open you are, right? If you're one of these, we've always done it this way and this is the way it needs to be done, then it's going to be a little bit more challenging for you, right? Because you have to kind of let go of that mentality. Now, if you're more flexible and willing to learn different ways, right? Then yeah, you can absolutely learn it, but you just have to let go of like, oh no, we're just going to do it this way because that's how I've done it for 25 years. And I know more than you because I'm, what we call here an OG, right? It doesn't work that
Oh,
way.
I was going to say boomer. Oh,
Yeah. Oh, oops.
well, that's maybe that's just me. Just me. Sorry.
Yeah, I think everyone has the potential to learn. It's just a little bit, it's just a mindset shift. And you do have to, hit the books again, right? And get hands-on again if you really want to understand it. The good thing is that a lot of the foundational basics are still important, right? So if you know networking, you're coming in with an advantage. If you know, routing and switching or anything like that, you are coming in with an advantage because I think the skills are translatable.
Okay. So from your perspective, what are the biggest gaps in cloud security that enterprises can't or don't know how to handle?
I think it's the knowledge gap, right? At least this is what I've seen so far. It's the thing where, it's for a lot of companies, they're finally moving towards cloud. For the past, I think the pandemic forced a lot of companies to move quicker. Prior to the pandemic, what I was noticing when I was visiting a lot of these like Fortune 100 and Fortune 500 customers was that they were really hesitant, right? And it was primarily because they've been used to this, let's sit behind a firewall, we're going to protect everything in our environment. And they were used to this control, right? But that doesn't really scale as well. So they were taking their time and not really moving production workloads into the cloud because of this fear. And then also because they didn't really have folks on hand that knew or know the cloud, right? Or know each cloud provider or have a lot of extensive hands-on experience. So now with COVID, or just with the pandemic in 2020 and with the remote workforce, I think more companies had to kind of like just run towards it. And I think that will that is potentially going to expose a lot of organizations, right? Because now we have to protect against more threats, and one of them being misconfiguration in the cloud. That's a really critical one because of the lack of knowledge and understanding. So it's something that we all need to kind of work towards and help. But it's a
Yeah,
challenge.
absolutely. I remember one ransomware incident that happened with the state of Colorado with their Department of Transportation. And what happened, how the attacker got in and was able to deploy the ransomware, is that an administrator created a cloud instance, and it was just supposed to be temporary. It was just, for some project that they were working on, and they had joined it to their domain. To their Active Directory domain, but they didn't bother doing a lot of the additional configurations that you would do if you were going to keep that instance around. And they set a weak password. And as soon as they had gotten it up, I think there were brute force attacks trying to guess the password that went on for like 2 days. And finally, they guessed the password. And they got in, and because it was joined to the domain, they were able to move laterally into the Department of Transportation's environment, plant the ransomware, and you can actually read a lot of details about that breach. They were very good at being, open about the details. They had to bring in the National Guard to help with the response because it really turned into a huge event, weeks and weeks and weeks of downtime and recovery, and all because they felt like something was temporary because it was in the cloud, and therefore they didn't treat it seriously, but they treated it the same way they would treat the rest of their on-premises enterprise infrastructure and made it trusted by joining it to the domain.
We see this often.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty scary. But I mean, what they say, like no one incident goes to waste or whatever, something like that. Hopefully. So hopefully they learned from this and other organizations will learn from it as well. But yeah, you basically cannot set it and forget it. Because that one little mistake can cause a tornado. Yeah.
So how do enterprises deal with this? Because it seems like there's so much room for error and
Yeah.
there's so much room for mistakes, and there is a learning curve for
Yeah.
everybody who has to move into the cloud. From a policymaker perspective, what do you think we can and should expect from enterprises who move into the cloud, or from cloud providers? What should they owe their customers?
I mean, I personally believe that they should owe their customers transparency. There are a lot of things, and I think for the most part, most of them do, but I think that things can get a little bit muddy at times, because the focus is on selling, right? On selling the service, on selling more SaaS, on selling more products. Now it's selling security, security capabilities. And a lot of customers decide that, oh, well, that's like a best of suite thing or best of breed thing. So I'm just going to purchase it. I don't know anything about it. I'm just going to purchase it. So there's like this pressure involved, right? And I think that there should continue to be the shared responsibility. I think the vendors have a responsibility to be super transparent and not to oversell stuff that customers don't really need, right? I see this a lot. And then from a company perspective, like whether it's a CISO or whoever's purchasing software for the company, it's like do a little bit more due diligence. I understand people are pressed for time, but a little bit of due diligence does goes a long way, right? Like don't just purchase the SaaS product because it's the latest and greatest cool thing. Really, negotiate support, right? A support contract or maybe professional services with the company to help you implement it and make sure that it's configured per best practice, and then make sure that you're getting like yearly assessments, right? To test your configuration. So a lot of the basics, like a lot of the foundations, I think that's important. That still should, that thinking should still transfer over to the cloud, right? Like just because you've now migrated to the cloud doesn't mean that you just like leave it alone. You still need to have governance around it. But yeah, I wouldn't put the onus on one over the other. I think it's both. Unfortunately, because of the state of the world and this pandemic, things have been rushed. People need to go move fast or faster now, in order to like prepare the workforce at the time. And my hope and my recommendation is that a lot of those companies go back to like test what they've configured, right? If you rush through it, then put this on your priority list, right? Like have a yearly assessment, have an audit, hire a company that will go in to take a look at the configuration, at the security configuration, and just highlight what you've missed and what you can like tune up. So basically get a tune up, just like we get tune ups in our car. You need yearly tune ups, right? Because another reason is because even if you've done everything correctly, the vendors do make changes, and sometimes they're not going to notify you personally. Sometimes they'll update their documentation, which could be like a one line item on a website that you haven't checked in like 5 months. And that could be like, it's enabled by default or something like that. So it's important to make sure that you're constantly tuning and checking. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So in your experience, what do cybersecurity vendors struggle with or skip over when it comes to security? Like, for example, when I was involved with a large cloud migration project where we were virtualizing all the systems in 27 state data centers here in the state of Texas and consolidating them into 2 new state data centers. This is about 10 years ago. One of the problems we ran into was when we wanted to get logs from our particular systems, the vendor could not separate ours out from the other agency's logs. And so we just couldn't get those logs. And I would hope that it's gotten better now. But you know, what kind of things are still you know, suboptimal in your view?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're getting better with things like, those like logging tools and seams, but what I noticed is that they're not, when a cloud vendor goes in, they may ask you about your environment, but they're not going to drill into your environment, right? So they don't understand the nuances of your specific environment. They're going to try to solve generic use cases, or maybe one or two of the top use cases for your environment, right? Like, oh, we need to get our identities into the cloud because we need to use Office 365 or something, or Google Workspace or whatever. So they're going to solve for that, right? They don't necessarily understand the rest of your environment. So I think there's a huge gap there, because again, it's all about, the people that come in from the cloud vendor, usually sales folks, right? And they're doing their job, right? They're trying to sell. And it makes it a little bit tricky, because then it just, everything feels a little bit rushed. And then you go out and deploy something that you really don't have a foundational understanding of, and or that you don't really need, right? This may not have been the solution that you really needed in your environment. So I think it's important, to understand the environment that you're in, right? Whether it's finance or, I don't know, government, right? Like, understand the environment and understand your needs, right? Don't just buy into a product because the vendor says it's cool, or because you want to have a relationship with that vendor, right? Especially if you don't necessarily need it, because you're just exposing yourself to additional risk, right? So,
Yeah,
yeah.
I saw a few years ago that there was some vendors were advertising cloud services for industrial control systems. And I
Mhm.
thought, "Oh my God, really? You want to put ICS in the cloud?" And I got really scared. Is that really a thing? Is that a thing now?
That's a good question. I'm not really focused on the ICS area, but I wouldn't doubt it. Why not, right? I mean, again, it's all about marketing and sales. And so if there's a need, which, industrial control systems is pretty popular, right?
Mhm.
There has been in the news a lot. They're going to try to create something or sell something, for it. Though that's not my space, so I don't have too much experience on that end. But it wouldn't surprise me, to be honest, if
Mhm.
there were a solution, right? Hey, let's put ICS systems on public cloud. I don't necessarily think it's possible, because there's a lot of legacy code and legacy hardware, which the cloud doesn't necessarily like as much. But yeah, it anything is possible these days, Wendy.
Oh boy. So so far we have three questions posted in Q&A. So if they are UT students, three of them will get free copies of the book. We got two more spaces. So we got some really good questions so far. Two more people. We need some good questions here as I continue. Um, so there's security. This is the hardest part, I think, for people to understand. There's security for the cloud, which means like securing the applications that are running in the cloud. There's security in the cloud, which is securing the cloud infrastructure itself. And then there's security from the cloud, like running security tools in the cloud to secure something else outside the cloud. So, what do people get most confused about when these are three different use cases? Um, how do people kind of sort these out?
I think because it's different, it looks a little bit different across each cloud provider. I think people put it all in one bucket, right?
Hmm.
They don't understand that um, you have to go to different places and you have to tune different knobs, and it's not all the same thing, right? So I think it's important to, and that's part of the like going back and getting and gaining that education, because you need to understand the differences, and you need to understand, um, depending on your use cases, when one applies over the other. So I think, to answer your question, what they get confused is that there are differences, right? It's just known as cloud security, and
Yeah.
folks don't really focus too much on like the specifics of like what does it really mean, right? Um, so yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, like you're running firewalls in the cloud. to protect your network traffic from your headquarters, that's really different from, let's say, the security that you are going to use to secure what the workloads you're running in Amazon AWS. And and that is very different from the security that, let's say, Salesforce is running to secure the application that they are making available to users from the cloud. That there's security inside
Yep.
that is totally separate. So
Very much separate. And even within, like, even across different cloud providers, I know, like, as an example, like on Azure, there's like the Azure security configuration, and then there's like the, Azure AD Office 365 configuration, which is pretty separate. It's separate but equal. So you kind of have to understand, are you building, VMs in Azure? You need to lock those down. Are you setting up network groups in Azure? You need to lock those down. Are you deploying Office 365 or M365? You need to lock that down. And then depending on the workload, that also has different security configurations. So it's a little bit disparate. It's not really centralized. You don't really have like a single pane of glass. And I think that sometimes can overwhelm people, especially if they're not focused in one area, right? If they're like the office folks and not the, the VM folks internally at a company. So it does get a little bit tricky. Yeah.
mhm. All right, let me start with a couple of questions here. One from Willie Vasquez, who asks, what impact did the Kaseya ransomware incident have on companies' interest in moving to cloud?
There have been so many ransomware incidents that I don't even remember the Kaseya and like what specifically that had. But what I will tell you is that I think there's a combination, right? I think there's a split. A lot of companies definitely want to move to the cloud for scale purposes, despite the fear of like cloud misconfiguration, which, as we've seen, is still like a top, it's like on the top list of like things that can go wrong. But I think that has opened up more of a conversation around like the shared responsibility model, and for customers to understand where is the line, like where do cloud providers draw the line between what they are responsible for and if there's an incident, right, versus what you are responsible for. So I think what it has done, I think all of these incidents, not specific to Kaseya, but I think that all of these incidents have opens up the conversation, right, between, hey, what happens if there's an incident, and how do we integrate this into our SOC, right? Like, we're not, now we're looking at a little bit more than just our on-prem. So we need to account for that and have a process.
Yeah, I can imagine, especially in forensics, when you have a breach and you're going to your provider and saying, look, we need to know which administrators had access to our data at this point in time. And if they go, no, we're not going to give you any names. How do you negotiate that? And, that's very different from business as usual. Have you dealt with a lot of incident response?
Not really. I've kind of stayed away from that from afar because that's too messy. I've looked at it from afar, like, good luck, guys. No, no. But I mean, when you're internal at Microsoft, we would work specifically with a lot of Fortune customers, and so we would be made aware if there were an incident. A lot of times it was due to cloud misconfiguration or just ransomware, right? Like, the classic: someone sent an email, someone clicked on a link, someone opened up a Word doc or an Excel doc, and there were macros. And it's very messy. It's very messy. There were also incidents of organizations actually losing their entire environment, but because they had migrated to the cloud, they were able to save at least a portion, right? Like, there's a company that you can actually look up. I think they're overseas. They had just migrated, so they were syncing their identities into the cloud. They got attacked, right? There was a ransomware attack. They lost their entire production environment, like 20 years of data. Like, they lost
20 years.
Something like that. Like, they're an established company. I won't give the name, but they're an established company, and they lost their entire infrastructure, like everything. But their employees were still able to email because they had migrated their email to the cloud, right? So that's another thing that's very impactful. Like, I think organizations are seeing that as well. that, hey, if something happens, do we have a way to continue business as usual, right? Like, what is our business continuity and what is the impact? How will we be impacted if we don't have any workloads in the cloud, right? And what does that mean? So there's a whole discussion around that and ROI really, but yeah, that's just like one example that I can think of quickly.
Yeah, that's wild.
Yeah.
Okay, another question from Ricardo Beltran, who asks, are DLP policies considered another level of protection in the cloud? Are data loss prevention policies considered another level of protection?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That definitely is another layer of loss prevention, especially when it comes to like email. There's also something called information protection as well. So that deals more with like, it's part of DLP, but it's more about like classifying the data. So like a document, like a Word document, like classifying it internally and understanding what type of data, what kind of data you have in your environment and you're dealing with, and whether it's like PII, right? Like personal, if it has personally identifiable information, or if it's data that should be classified as like internal only. So I think DLP is just another layer of that, right? It helps to kind of, this whole like defense in depth model that we always talk about. It helps on the data layer side. So, but it shouldn't be the only mechanism of control, right? You should have other things in the background as well.
Yeah,
Filter.
because I always wonder about, classification and everything, because in my experience, a lot of people don't want to spend time classifying their data. They don't want to have meta thoughts about it. They just want to do their work instead of going, well, I need to send this to so and so. Do I have to classify it like this for it to get to them, or do I have to down classify it to make sure it gets to them? And then, yeah, I don't know. I'm a real skeptic when it comes to that.
Yeah, the good thing is that there are a lot of tools now that allow you to classify the actual data. Like, so like if you see what looks to be like a social security number, you can mark that file or that document as like you know, a critical document or internal only, right? So it could be basically based on the metadata instead of just saying, okay, do I think this document should be encrypted or not? Like putting the onus on the end user to make that decision. You could just set up DLP policies to help you out with that, to automate the responses.
hmm Well, I actually tried to do that when I was at the Texas Education Agency, and just to stop SSNs from being mailed outside, because our general counsel asked me to set up this mail filter. And it turns out that it's also really good at finding typoed phone numbers. Like if you're missing a digit from the middle part, it looks exactly like a social security number. And also court docket numbers apparently are in the same format. So we were catching all sorts of stuff that wasn't social security numbers. And then, like a few months later, the general counsel came to me and said, "Oh, good work. You stopped one of my emails from going out. I was, trying to email something to myself and it had a social security number in it." I said, "What were you emailing?" And he said, "Oh, I was, trying to send myself a performance evaluation to my private account at home to work on it." And I was like, "But that, that, why were you sending this to your private account? You're the one who asked me to stop people from doing this. Why were you doing it?" So it's like it makes me crazy.
That's a huge one, right? Yeah, that's a huge one. I think sometimes we're just, we're so like, I don't know, we're everyone's always trying to be so productive all day that we just sometimes, oh, we'll just deal with it later forward, right?
Yeah.
It's, yeah, which
Oh,
can turn
it's
out to be a bad thing.
um now going back to the idea of breaches like Sunburst made us all look more closely at linchpin providers
Mhm.
that are essentially a central attack target and a potential point of compromise for millions of organizations, like Microsoft or Google or Amazon. What do we need to know about cloud providers and their security in order to have this discussion?
Well, first of all, you need to be aware of how they handle security internally, right? Like as far as who has access to your data, who has access um, to implement, to deploy tools internally. It gets a little bit tricky again, because going back to like the whole shared responsibility model, there are some things that they will, they will tell you, we are responsible for this and you are responsible for that, right? And they may or may not answer questions as far as like what they are responsible for and how they handle it. But I would be skeptical if a company did, was not transparent, right? If they didn't want to give me information on, some of their internal processes, then I would be super skeptical. Which I believe that the three providers do give that information, or at least give you most of the information, and don't expect you to just trust, right? But yeah, it's tricky, right? Because there's only so much you can do. If there's a breach on their end and you're exposed, like, what I've seen mostly is that they say, like, we take your security seriously, but then when you find out what the breach was, it's something so like, wait, so you just had so-and-so admin that quit 6 months ago and you guys don't even have proper identity and access management internally, like, you know what I mean? So sometimes it's so simple that it's kind of scary. But I don't want to be like pessimistic. I just want to say that, like, it's important for everyone to do their due diligence and ask questions. Like, don't be afraid to ask, even if it's like outlandish, right? Even if you want specifics, even if you're just like, we want to know who has access to your data centers, right? Like, you know what I mean? Like, get down to the nitty gritty and ask these questions, right? Because at the end of the day, you need to protect your environment. So, ask questions and get things documented, not only verbal answers. Have the documentation so you can say, hey, you told me this is what is documented, this is a breach of contract, right? And you can take legal action if necessary.
Yeah, another problem that I've seen, or an objection that I've seen really large companies have with the cloud, is that they would feel that even if the vendor didn't, or the provider didn't, keep to the terms of service,
Mhm.
to the service level agreements, the only remedy they would get is like service credits. Okay, we won't charge you for the next 2 months. So it's like, you're going to give us some more of this crappy service for free. How is that supposed to help us? So
Yeah,
they would feel like the providers didn't have enough skin in the game, that to really trust them. Is that something you've seen too?
I have seen that. I've seen that in many cases. Like, I've seen instances where the multi-factor authentication services fails, and companies are pretty much down and their users cannot authenticate. And the resolution is like, yeah, we apologize, but we'll give you the service credits, or because we didn't meet our SLAs, we'll give you this credit or that credit. But that's pretty much all they can do. I mean, there's really nothing else they can do. So that's why, as someone who has worked in enterprises, and I'm sure you know this as well, Wendy, it's like, you always have to have a backup for a backup plan. Like, you cannot just rely on one vendor, one SaaS provider, one cloud provider. You have to think about the what if scenarios. I told my daughter that yesterday. I told her, it's important to not think negative, but it's equally important to think about what if, right? So you do need to pose those, not ideal scenarios so that you can plan for them as best you can. Obviously, there are things that you just cannot plan for, but if you're at least a little prepared, it's better than scattering at the last minute, right? So what happens if your MFA provider goes down because of an outage or whatever? Like, do you have a backup? Can you, switch it to something else, right? Can you switch it to not ideal SMS or something else, tokens or whatever? But you need to kind of think about these scenarios. Yeah.
Okay. All right, final reminder, there is still room for UT students to put questions into Q&A and get a free copy of Christina's book. Here's one more that has come out from Lillian Mies-Frey. What do you study to go into cybersecurity jobs?
What did I study, or what does one study?
I guess, what does one study, but also what
Yeah.
did you study?
Yeah. So, like I said, I've been in the industry for over 2 decades, and I myself started in network administration and system administration. So I studied information technology, and I was really focused on like Active Directory and in the enterprise. And so that's how basically my experience with dealing with Active Directory and sysadmin is what got me the job, got me an IT security job. I moved into like an identity and access management team, or IT security team within a finance organization. I cannot tell you what you studied today, and this is why. Because when I started in security, things were different, right? The world was different. And what I studied may not necessarily be applicable today. I know that today there are a lot of like cybersecurity degrees. I'm actually going for a master's in computer science with a focus on cybersecurity at Georgia Tech. But there are different programs, but those programs didn't exist when I was coming up, right? So I had to kind of start from the bottom and understand, foundational concepts, understand things like the OSI model, right? Like in the TCP/IP model, and what these stacks were in order to work the jobs that I worked. But I would definitely say, take a look at different communities, different organizations that provide training. SANS is a great organization. Take a look at your local colleges or your local universities to see what programs they offer. And then obviously my favorite is a lot of kind of self-studying and hands-on. But it's really difficult. I think the best place to learn is on the job, right? But I know it's really difficult for folks to get these degrees. So I think to get these entry-level roles. So I think it has to be a combination of like network like crazy, right? Not tactical networking, but really develop relationships with folks and ask questions to understand what people do and what area you want to go into. And that's another thing, you have to really understand which area you're interested in, right? Because there are different learnings depending on the area. If you come from a CS background and you have software engineering experience, maybe application security is where you want to go, right? So you really have to hone in on the area you want to get into, and then maybe what programs, learning programs are available, or what self-studying you can do on your own in order to get that first kind of entry-level job, or that even if it's not entry-level, that shift into that role. So it looks a little bit different. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. I mean, I also was a sysadmin, and I moved from there into security because you have to deal with a lot of security issues as a sysadmin anyway. But to be fair, I was actually in Plan 2 here at UT in the Liberal Arts Honors Program, and didn't actually graduate. So there are lots of different ways to get into security, and
Exactly.
you do not have to have the credentials. Um, but certainly having hands-on experience and learning and the networking, as Christina was talking about, are very helpful. There is so much now, so many specialties available in
Yep.
security that there weren't before. So if you have a particular area that you're really keen on, like forensics um, uh, or national security policy or IT law or um, uh, just about anything, computational biology, anything that you're using computing for, you're going to have to secure.
Yep.
So if you have an interest in a particular area and you want to like slather some security on top, you can probably get a job doing that.
Yeah.
Cool. Let me see if there's any more questions. Okay, one more from Willie. You mentioned insecure configurations as one of the biggest threats that companies face. Do you see this getting better via secure default configurations, or are people moving to the cloud more quickly than systems can be secured?
That's a really great question. Yes and no. So I do see it getting better with default security configuration, but again, we still have to, for consumers or for enterprises, we still have to do our due diligence, right? Because we just cannot trust that the provider is going to secure everything. Even if they say, oh, well, once you set up a tenant, everything is secured or locked down by default. That's usually not the case. But even if some things were, you still need to not trust and verify, right? So I think that's part of it. And then what was the second part of the question?
The second part of it was, let me see. Do you see this getting better, or are people moving to the cloud more quickly than systems can be
Yeah.
secured?
Yes, yes, which is what I alluded to earlier. Companies are moving to the cloud rapidly, right? And a lot of times, I think we always think that, oh, it's this like national conglomerate or international conglomerate that has like millions of users. Sometimes it could be like our local government office, right? Moving to the cloud because they need to use a SaaS tool or something, and they may not have the hands-on experience, right? And then you have other organizations, from small to medium to larger businesses that because of scalability, they have to move into the cloud, right? They're growing, or they need to be able to process faster. So they're moving into the cloud quicker. And then obviously, with this global pandemic, the entire world was pretty much working from home. So companies that previously didn't allow their end users to work from home had to shift very, very quickly, and make sure that their users were able to be productive, right? Faster. So yeah, definitely. I think that, you're right. Companies are moving to the cloud at an extremely rapid pace. And that's why we need more folks focused on cloud security and securing all things, right? Because we need to be able to help protect these environments. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing is that whenever there is a security gap, there is a market for more vendors, more startups to come in with more software. And so we are seeing more cloud security management, configuration, um, software, more tools that are going to be layered on, like, oh, well, if you want to secure the cloud, you got to buy this other tool. And you got to buy this other tool. And that leads to the security in depth, or the expense in depth, that,
Yeah.
as Rick Holland calls it.
Yeah.
I don't know whether that's the right answer to say, well, if you want it to be secure, you got to buy one more thing that the vendor isn't giving you by default. I just don't know if that's the direction we should be going in.
Absolutely not. I agree with you, Wendy. I don't agree that that's a direction we should be going in, because I just think that opens us up more for more risk, right? Like, I think that a lot of times where we fail are the basics. And I understand, right? Like the basics are super difficult. They can be hard. You're battling, making the company productive. Security is a business expense. So they're not looking at us like, oh, you guys are money makers, right? We're money spenders. And so a lot of times it's very difficult to prioritize going back and patching or doing the basics, right? Over, let's just buy this new tool because so and so has a relationship. So there's a lot of politics involved as well, which is critical, like, to understand. You have to understand that, as they say, security is, or cybersecurity is not really I don't agree that it's not an IT problem, but I do agree that it is also a people problem, right? Because you do need to get buy-in, but also folks need to understand why we need these things, why we need to go back to the basics, why we need to continue to work on the basics versus layering yet another tool that's just going to cause more problems, right? Because there isn't a silver bullet, right? There isn't like a single pane of glass or this magic tool that's going to do everything for you. There's always going to be a gap. Unless you build the tool yourself, which brings on another set of problems, right? So
It
yeah.
does. It does for sure. And the other thing that I've seen about clouds, cloud providers and security, is that, especially with all the tenants that they have, they have to, if you've got something in your own data center, you know exactly what you want to have accessing that infrastructure, and you can put in firewall rules to block everything else. But the problem is that they have so many different tenants using so many different agents and so much different software that they pretty much can't block anything. Sure, you can, in general, you can make your own rules as to what can connect to your particular instances. And if you remember to do that, like we were talking about with configuration, that's great. But the provider can't block it for you. They have to let like everything in, because they've got hundreds or thousands or hundreds of thousands of tenants, all that need that connectivity, so their network configuration is like wildly open because it
Yeah,
has to be.
right. And it's, if you're the on the other end as a customer, it's your responsibility to lock it down, right? Based on your specific use cases. And I think that's often missed. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think we're ever going to change that, for example, by um, setting baseline requirements that providers have to supply for all their customers in terms of security, any kind of minimums?
I would hope so. I mean, I would hope so. I've since I'm kind of focused on the Microsoft side, what I have seen is like Microsoft pushing out this like security defaults configuration, and like all new tenants have that enabled by default, and so kind of really tackling that problem, like of if you're not going to do, if you don't know what you're doing yet, or you're still learning, or there's a process, if you enable these kind of security defaults, it'll block these four things for you, right? It'll block legacy authentication, it will enable MFA for you. So like these basics, right, are super important. I think that, I don't know if, I'm always on the fence about whether policy will really help. Like maybe, right? Like, can we really force these vendors to do this? Potentially. Um, I think a lot of vendors are doing it automatically now. I know Microsoft is. I don't know about the others. I would hope that they are. Uh, but then again, it's difficult, right? Because now you're talking about their ability to make more money, right? Potentially, or selling yet another tool or another product or another like upsell, right? So
Yeah.
it's a deeper conversation that goes into responsibility and ethics and all of that stuff, right? So yeah, maybe our government can I think our government also struggles in their own environment. So I don't know that they're gonna, it's yeah. And they deal with completely different, right? They have their private cloud, so their configuration looks a little bit different than like public cloud, for instance. So it's all tricky. But I will say that I am optimistic, and I hope that that is the case.
All right, cool. Well, thank you, Christina, so much for sharing your expertise with us. Don't forget, look in the chat for the link to her book, which is coming out with all sorts of great wisdom in there. And
Mhm.
I just want to encourage everybody to look for the next one of these in our series, which will be at the beginning of November. Check the website. The title of that one is going to be When You Stare into the drone also stares back at you. And that's going to be a fun security discussion too. So thanks everybody for coming in, and we will see you next time.
Thank you. Bye.